Douglas is as I said, the chairman and the CEO for Knowledge Management Institute. These are the people who invented the Certified Knowledge Manager certification, which is the elite certification in knowledge management in the world. Now, Douglas started this endeavor since 1992, and he has been working all his life before then and until now in developing furthermore the knowledge management discipline. They actually have their own book of knowledge, and they have a very hard certification to attain. You have to be very serious about it. We intersected before several times, but one of the interesting intersections is that we were working on a mega agribusiness project in Africa, in the sugar industry. And there was a person whose title was Chief Knowledge Officer. And this Chief Knowledge Officer, he was certified knowledge manager by Knowledge Management Institute. He actually attended the training with Douglas, studied, and got certified. When we started to work with him, it made a huge difference in our establishing their portfolio program office for their projects. And since then, I got to notice the value of the knowledge behind the Knowledge Management Institute, and we started to collaborate since then. This is why I'm happy to host Douglas tonight with us. So Douglas, any luck with the camera yet?
No, I signed into something else and I could see myself. The camera's working, but it's not working with your connection. How about if you just put up my handsome face as a static picture, and my voice will have to carry you, and you're going to be watching my PowerPoint slides anyway. So
okay. Perhaps at the end for the question and answers, you might be able to solve this, because it's much better to see you when we start our interaction. So having said that, I'm gonna give you the control and welcome Douglas, if you like to speak a little bit about your background, and I will be listening with the rest of us. Welcome again.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time with you, but I'm looking forward to many in the future if I do a good job.
Of course. We have the privilege of having you with us. Now, since you're speaking without the camera, you might turn it off so that it does not show the black box.
All right.
Okay.
So here's my bio. Everybody can read that. And I expect that people are going to ask for a copy of these slides after the event, and I'm more than happy to provide them. So if you want to read my bio a little more carefully, or go look me up on KM Institute, that's fine. Just a little disclaimer here. I think someplace you said I was a PhD, but that's a mistake. I don't want to claim false notoriety. And I don't have real credentials in project management. However, project management is such a general skill that most people have some sense of it. And most of us that have been in business for a long time, such as myself, have been doing project management, for better or for worse, for a long time, and we understand the basic fundamentals of it. More importantly than just understanding the basic fundamentals is understanding the importance of project management. In fact, I don't know if I got to add an extra little slide here. No, I don't think I did. But I just read yesterday, and I made some notes to myself. I'll try to recall them from memory, that Google has just announced, along with a number of other very large firms, that they think while a college education is good, they have a real high demand for some basic skills that just aren't robust enough in the workforce. So they're putting in tens of millions of dollars into a program, a training program, to train in 3 particular skills. Now I could ask you what you think those skills are, and you're all biased, so most all of you would say project management, and you'd be right. The 3 skills are data analytics, which is becoming very popular because of all the data that's flooding into computers and the corporations everywhere, based on the concept called Internet of Things. And if you have never heard of Internet of Things, I like to sometimes call it Internet of Everything. So if everything is hooked up to the internet and data is being collected from all over the world on all kinds of things, then certainly people who can analyze that data are going to be in high demand. So the first one was data analytics. The second one was project management. And the last one was user design, user interface design. Obviously, that's a computer type person who makes programs more amenable, compatible to human consumption, rather than something that you find to be very quirky and full of bugs or whatever else. So I have always known and always appreciated that project management is essential. And I'm going to make a case today that knowledge management is also an emerging and essential activity going on in the world. And it needs project managers. So if you've never really focused on this concept that I call the knowledge age, some call it knowledge society, others call it knowledge economy, but whatever you call it, there's some new things that are emerging, and project managers ought to be aware of them. And there'll be some great opportunities to apply project management skills in this domain. So let me start off with an introduction to that. I'm going to have my first poll, and Saadi, you're going to manage the polling, and I'm going to ask you the following question, and I want to see what your response is. I'll read the question while Saadi is setting up for you to be able to make an answer to it or give an answer, and then we'll see what the results were. Throughout human history, and we're talking about the last 10 or 12,000 years since the last ice age, the world has gone through many major, even episodic changes. By episodic, I mean dramatic changes that really influence everything and make a transformation to what's going on. So the question is, in your opinion, which changes had the most impact on human occupations? Now, I don't know how the polling is going to work. I'm going to sit back, and I think Saadi's going to provide to you a poll, and you're going to answer it, and it's going to take about 30 seconds. And we'll have some results, and we'll talk about those results. Am I correct on that, Saadi?
Yes, Douglas, they are answering it already.
Okay.
And it seems it's stabilizing. So I'm gonna end the poll, and you're gonna see the results in, say, 5 seconds.
Okay. So other than my video, everything else is working fine, right?
Yes. Okay. So we'll end it in 3, 2, 1. Okay. Do you see the statistics in front of you?
No, I do not.
If you press on the poll on the right.
Okay, press on the poll on the right. Let's see. Give me a hint as to where it is.
There's the settings attendees chat polls.
Okay, where is it? Up in the upper right-hand corner, or lower left, or lower right-hand corner?
On the right, in the middle, settings attendees chat. Yeah, polls. There's a tab called polls.
Got it.
Okay.
Got it. All right. All right. So I assume everybody can see that.
Yes.
It's not surprising to me. Usually when I'm making a presentation, I start off with metals because everybody understands it, but they may not thought it had much of an impact on human occupations. The one that I'm most interested in, but there's a high correspondence between them, and that's 4 and 5. I'm going to talk today about number 4. Number 5 is actually very complementary to it, and if you read the little subtitle under education there, from parent-child to schools, universities, you understand that education is about training, and training, education or training, and/or training, is about increasing a person's body of knowledge. And that's what I'm going to focus on with number 4, that the world has gone through major changes based on switching from what I list there as a subtitle, muscle power to knowledge power. I respect your answers. I differ with them a little bit, but I'm handing back and saying the choosing of number 5 is, I agree with you, is essential. It may or may not have had as much impact on human occupations, but it certainly is the critical factor in this age that we're talking about, the knowledge age. So now I just go hit the next, and I can move on to my next slide. Is that right? Okay, so here's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Just to make sure you appreciate that there are various types of ages, and whichever historian you're talking to, they may have a bias or a fascination with one particular type. Most of them are major impacts on the world. For instance, the ages that focused on the Stone Age and then the Bronze Age, and etc., had an impact on tools and weapons in the earliest days, all the way through to modern technology. In fact, I should have a couple of pictures of some Middle East buildings there, as opposed to this 1936, I think it was, Empire State Building in New York. But that was one of the first big skyscrapers, and it was totally dependent on steel. So the steel age that allowed the building of bridges and skyscrapers was maybe the culmination of this metallurgical advancement, but somebody might say silicon is the next stage that enables computers. So these are important ages that we can study, but very few have the same impact on human occupations as the one I'm about to describe to you. So let me click my animation here. That's the summary of what I've just said. But there's an, in my own personal opinion, and I'm going to ask you in a moment or two what you think about it, but in my own personal opinion, there's been an even more impactful view of the ages that has had an impact on humans and, in fact, an impact on human occupations. And that's what we're going to be focusing on in the knowledge age. So here's a history of these episodic changes that have gone on in the world. Thousands of years ago, at least 5,000 to 10,000 years ago or so, people were called hunter-gatherers. If you've never heard that term, it's pretty self-explanatory. Somebody in the family or in the tribe had to go out and hunt to get protein, and others might have been gathering fruits and nuts and whatnot to, just in case they didn't catch anything and you didn't want your tribe or your group to starve. But since the last ice age, that was the first major human existence, human occupations. It was actually more, you could almost subtitle it survival. Subsequent to that, a few thousand years later, and you all recognize that picture, no matter where you come from in the world, there were certain parts of the world that had easily domesticated plants and animals. Other parts did not. The parts of the world that had easily domesticated plants and animals were able to move into something which I'm sure you've heard the term, agrarian age. You went from this prehistory time, where the hunter-gatherers were, through till about the 1700s. The agrarian age is where people were able to do farming, ranching, whatever you want to call it, but they had control over their food production as opposed to having to go out and hope to find some, whether you're picking it in the woods or you're hunting for it on the plains. But the agrarian age lasted for a long time, and in those days, about 80% of the world or more were involved in raising the food to sustain the world's population. The world's population wasn't that big, but sustaining it was still a major task. By the 1700s or so, and there's no fixed date when this started, some say in the United Kingdom in the late 1700s, when they started capitalizing on wind and in particular water power, they started automating a few of the processes and enabled manufacturing of things. And that was the start of the industrial age. And it lasted, in fact, it's still going on. In fact, we are always going to be making food, growing food, or raising food, and we're always going to be making and moving things, which is the industrial age. So these ages never really end. It's just the proportion of people that are involved in those ages. So for instance, well, I'll just hold off on that one. I'll give you an example in a moment. By the late 1900s, another age started to emerge. And we typically call it the information age. Some call it the digital age, but we're talking about the same thing, the advent of computers. Some might say the advent of computers was a tail end of the industrial age, the mechanization or automation of things. I'm not going to get an argument over that, but clearly by the mid-1900s through 2000 or so, many people began to have the job associated with operating their computers. In other words, they were doing things that prior to that was office work, but it was manual office work, but now they were automating it. Some of the industrial age machinery was being automated or controlled by computers, but clearly in the 1950s to the 2000s, the information age dominated. I keep wanting to click out here. See my cursor out on the screen? I keep wanting to click, but there's a button down the bottom I have to go to. I apologize. I'll get used to that soon. By about 1900 or so, it probably started before then, but certainly by about 2000, I meant to say. Excuse me for that. By about 2000, and it did start probably in the 1980s and 1990s, but clearly by 2000 it was well known, well popularized. The knowledge age started to emerge. It hasn't been around nearly as long as the other ages, so it's not as well known. And whether we end up calling it the knowledge age, the knowledge economy, or the knowledge society, and in different parts of the world, those three different titles are used. It doesn't matter what the name is. What does matter is what's going on. So let's reflect on the history of these ages. I clicked my next button, I think I hit it twice. In the earlier ages, you see that most of human occupations were dominated by muscle power. Even in the assembly plants, it was still highly dependent on humans having muscle power bring it to the assembly line. Later on in the late 1900s, computer power was the term you might use if you were describing what kind of power drives industry. But today, the expression is probably knowledge is power. And if you don't yet believe that, I'm hoping in the next few moments, we'll prove that to you. And in fact, what has been happening over the last 20 or 30 years is, I would make the statement that the future is already here. This last major episodic change is going to dramatically change human occupations. Just as a summary, and I can use this ancient Egyptian plowing to demonstrate the labor-intensive nature of the agrarian age. And I can use some of these statistics. And the one I like to quote, because I'm familiar with it, I come from the United States, so I know a little bit of our history. When the United States was first formed 250 years ago or so, most people that were productive in the United States economy were some variation of being a farmer. In fact, the claim is, though we can't know for sure, they didn't do census that could tell all of that today, but we have a good estimate that maybe 80% of labor was dedicated to growing food in some fashion. By the middle of the industrial age, let's say 1950s or so, the amount of effort devoted to farming or growing things had dropped substantially, and the industrial activities, the making and moving of things, had grown to replace the agrarian 80% to be about 80% itself. But today, most recent research has a dramatic change on both of those, the human occupations in both of those age categories. Today in the United States, and not necessarily true for all over the world, but in the United States, the production of food is something less than about 4%. And yet we're so productive in doing that, we export a lot of our food products. And the making and moving of products is about 16%. So the sum of those two is only about 20%, where in fact in the past it's been as high as 80%. So what are people doing today? They're doing knowledge age activities. And knowledge age activities is all about knowledge. It's all about brain power. It's all about a number of different categories. I'll sidestep and give you one example. Since you picked training or education as your highest category, you know that proper training gives a person the good aptitudes or skills or competencies to be able to do a job. And that's what we've been focusing on over the last 20, 30, 40 years or so. But in the knowledge age, there's another characteristic. I was trying to think of the proper word to use there. The other characteristic is, instead of aptitudes, which are the skills and competencies, it's attitudes. Attitudes are going to make the difference in the knowledge age. Attitudes are people's motivation to do things even better, to be achievers in their own job, whatever that job might be. So we're going to find out that in the knowledge age, we're not focusing on making people stronger or having stronger machines, because machines are going to replace a lot of human labor. And we'll talk for just a moment about robots, drones, and artificial intelligence. But what we're after is to leverage the expertise of humans, because we're going to leverage their attitudes about being high-performing people. And there's much research that's evolved over the last 10 to 20 years that says in the future, the companies that will be super achieving companies, high performance, healthy, and able to sustain themselves, will be doing that primarily not because they have more computers, because computers are becoming a commodity, but because they have high-performing people. So let me see what my next slide was here. In the knowledge age, that's what I've been describing to you. I think I'm about to pop, well, that's just the summary of what we've already talked about. Muscle power going to knowledge is power. And I mentioned the robots, drones, and artificial intelligence. And everybody is going to be a knowledge worker. So how are we going to make these people more productive? That is the challenge of the knowledge age. And so the situation, I'm going to read this, so you can read faster than I can talk, so you're probably already ahead of me. The even more dramatic view of human history, these major episodic events and their impact on human occupations, is the situation I have just described to you. We've gone through muscle power, knowledge is power, into the knowledge age. And again, this is a summary. We're going to dramatically change human occupations, or they're already in the process of changing. So let me ask you a question. Do you accept this assertion? Is the knowledge age a reality, or is KM just another IT system? And I think that's where I break to a, well, I guess let me see, is that where okay, I have a few more pieces of information to give you first. Let me do that, and then we'll do a quick poll on what you think. There's a concept in the study of, well, strategic planners consider this concept, but everybody else can as well. It's pretty obvious once it's mentioned. And the concept is of disruptive technologies. The technologies that come along and totally disrupt an industry. In fact, literally wipe out whatever the prior industry was and replace it with something brand new. Now, some of them are obvious. Well, I can use ones from history. When electricity was invented and widely distributed, it replaced manual power, because motors and engines could do things electrically powered that humans had to do with muscle power prior to that. That one dates back 100 years. Steam engines drove locomotives, so you could pull and haul stuff that in the past, prior to that, was driven by maybe horse-drawn carriages. Let's talk about modern times, because now modern times are happening even more quickly than they did 100 years ago. So I'm sure each one of you can come up with an example of a disruptive technology. Let me suggest one or two, just to make sure we're all thinking about the same thing. So think about the taxi industry. I don't know how big taxis are in your country. No matter what country you come from, there's a lot of taxis around, as I've noticed as I've traveled the world. But in the last 5 or 10 years, Uber and Lyft have come out and totally not replaced taxis, but certainly give them a competitive challenge, and in many cases supplanting the traditional taxi industry. Fast foods have replaced traditional restaurants. And especially in COVID-19 era, the last half year or so, instead of going to a store to buy something, people have gone even more online than they ever used to. So in the United States, Amazon has taken on to become one of the largest companies in the world in terms of valuation, because they're willing and able to deliver to anybody, and you don't have to go stand in the store with your mask on. It'll be delivered to your house. So I'm sure if we sat here for half an hour, we could come up with 15 or 20 of these totally disruptive technologies. So another one just flashed in my mind. When I was younger, VCRs were popular, and that was a great thing. You could record something off TV and watch it, or you could buy a VCR tape and play it at your convenience. It wasn't long before DVDs came along and replaced that. It wasn't long before being on the cloud and things coming down through cable or other means directly to your house. So each one of those was a totally disruptive technology that literally wiped out the prior competition. So that's what has happened, disruptive technologies. And they create some great complications because people have to make major shifts from whatever their job was to what it's going to be in the future. And sometimes it's the disruptive technology that totally wiped out their job. Other examples of things being wiped out can be given by this research. Now, this is probably a little small to read, depending how close you sit to your screen. I just want to give it as a sense for the disruptive technologies that are changing the world. This dates back about 7 years, but it's still pretty current. And it's done by a respected research group, that's McKinsey and Company. And what they have shown in their extensive research is that there are a couple of really important disruptive changes that I'll call the top 5. And then after that, there's a bunch of other ones as well, but not nearly as impactful. So let's see what some of those top 5 are. I listed a few here. All the top 5, and I added one more. No, actually, I have all 5. Okay. The top one is mobile computing. And how many disruptive industries were enabled by mobile computing? One that's of particular interest to us in this presentation is the automation of knowledge work. The Internet of Things, which I've mentioned might be called Internet of Everything. That's going to enable data analytics. Cloud computing is going to replace DVs and hard disks on your own computer because everything will be in the cloud. And advanced robotics will lead to the automation of all types of industrial work. There's one more down here, if I left it on, the 3D printing, which also is going to have a major impact on manufacturing. So those are the top disruptive technologies, and they're impacting every possible way in industry where people's occupations are depending on doing some kind of a job that's being radically changed by these disruptive technologies. So that's the complication. Robots, drones, and artificial intelligence are having a major impact. So there's my little graphic of that. And to reinforce it further, transformation will cause workplace make and move disruptions. In other words, what we used to make and move things with 80% of the population involved in doing those, the future is going to be where robots, drones, and artificial intelligence are going to be taking care of that. So you see there's very little humans involved here. So what are humans going to do? Here's just some more background information talking about computerization. That's describing also this emerging discipline or occupation called analytics. Because if we have 100 times the computing devices, we're going to have septillion devices. I can't even figure out how many zeros are on that. All collecting data, all needing to be analyzed if we're going to get insights. So before I go on to the next slide, I had this question that always comes up about this time. But wait a second, what is knowledge anyway? If you went to the dictionary, you get a definition pretty much such as the first phrase of this definition down here. Knowledge is understanding gained from experience. And that's a rock solid definition. It's existed all down through time, that most all of human experience has been the source of gaining knowledge. But in the future, it's going to be from some other things. And one of them, it's kind of introduced to you by this slide, is the analysis. The analysis of all these data sources is going to give us another form of knowledge that never existed as a source of knowledge in the past. It's always been from our own human experiences, but now it's going to be from our analytics. And another thing that's happening as well, I don't have it on here, it's kind of a side note, and that is that in the past, our sharing, I could add the word sharing here, so analysis and sharing. In the past, most of our sharing was probably from our parents, teaching us what we need to know as we grow up to become adults. And more recently, in the last couple hundred years, it's been sharing coming from teachers teaching us in school systems. In the future, sharing is going to become even more important because it's going to be employees sharing amongst themselves as well. So you don't need to be an expert on everything yourself. If somebody on your team has some of that expertise, that will contribute to the team's needs. So that's my introduction to this disruptive technologies and these transformations that have taken place. Here's some more reinforcement from McKinsey, same McKinsey that I've already quoted. And their quote is that in as recently as just last year, that I'm just going to summarize and say performance gaps among employees is going to be one of the key discriminators as to who's really successful and who isn't. So I think I made enough of a case for that. Okay, one more point. I think in all countries of the world, this concept of engagement as depicted here is common. But the term engagement used in human capital maturation has not been a common usage. But for the last 15 to 20 years, there's a concept called engagement. And this goes back to the word I used in terms of attitudes. Engaged people love their job and its environment, and they far outperform their contemporaries. We don't have time in this presentation to go in and support that with all the research that shows how high-performing people can be substantially better for their organization than non-high-performing people. But I want to ask you for your opinion, and I'm going to ask this question, and Saadi is going to set up the next poll, very simple one. What do you think are the average engagement levels around the world? In other words, what percentage of people by those 5 categories do you think would be called engaged? Okay, so there's 5 categories that span the spectrum from hardly anybody to a very large percentage. I want to get your feedback on that. And the question is, if an engaged person is a high-performing person that loves what they do and just looks forward to being at work and doing work, what percentage of people, when you test large numbers of people, like canvassing countries and large corporations and companies, do you think would be categorized as engaged? So I'm waiting for the test results. It looks like it's stabilizing. Some late starters there on 10 to 15%. It looks like the single mode distribution and 25 to 30%. Can I conclude with that, Saadi? You close enough? The answer is, in fact, 25 to 30%. So either you folks listening in to this webinar are into these kinds of things, and I congratulate you for studying and understanding what's going on in the world, or we have some great insights. But in either case, here's the dilemma. If only 25 to 30% of the people in the world across almost all countries are engaged, what do you think the potential is if we could get that up to 40 or 50 or even exceed 50? What if a company is able to exceed 50% and its competitors are still in the 25 to 30% range? Can you see the potential? Okay, well, that potential is very important, and it's one of the key areas that we focus on in knowledge management. So I'm going to give you now a little primer on what knowledge management is all about, and I'm going to do that by maybe a unique way of doing it. I'm going to provide to you 11 organizational characteristics, and we'll see how many we can get through in the time we have allotted here. And each one, I'm going to ask you a question of how important do you think this is to your own organization? In other words, does this characteristic appear in your own organization? And if it does, knowledge management has a solution for that characteristic. Maybe I shouldn't call it a solution. Knowledge management has an approach that will substantially improve the performance of that part of your organization that has that characteristic. Okay, well, I'm just talking here. Let's get into it, and it'll be more clear to you, I'm sure. So here's the first example. Well, this actually is just my description of what I'm looking for. You're going to answer based on these organizational characteristics, whether you think the characteristic is applicable at all to you, I mean, not applicable, or it's probably applicable or definitely very applicable. Okay, I'm interested to find out how many of you see when we go through these various characteristics, how many of you see that that particular characteristic is probably applicable to your own organization, or it's definitely very applicable to your organization. So here's the first one. Complex projects. Now I'm going to read each one of these characteristics. I want you to think about it for a moment or two and then make your call as to whether you think it's applicable or not. Listen carefully. Sometimes these are not trivial, so you have to listen carefully, and I'll speak slowly. Think about, does your organization do complex projects that have enough similarities that you could learn from one project to the next? Could you improve strategic project outcomes, less time, cost, better project results, etc.? Or avoid repeating past project management mistakes? Could you improve the project body of knowledge? So do you think, go back to the simple first phrase, do you have in your organization complex projects that have enough similarities that you could learn from one project to the next? I'll let you answer that. Looks like you're well on your way. All right, looks like it's stabilizing over somewhat different results than what we've gotten from our own research. Now, our research is probably not much larger than the group attending today. I don't know what the number of people in, it was at one time I heard it might be 200 people. Maybe it says 183 up there. Our research is a little larger than that, but in the same ballpark. It's a different audience. It's people who are doing knowledge management and are thinking about making improvements in their organization. Whereas I'm assuming you as project managers may not be thinking about that higher strategic goal, but are thinking about how you're going to improve doing your project. You're managing a project, you're involved as a project team member.
Douglas, let me please interrupt you. We have around 180 people currently with us.
Yes.
Number one. Two, our audience, many of them are project managers, but quite a few are directors, are senior people, people working on research and education from different disciplines, okay?
I would have expected that, and I'm glad to hear it. But the results turned out, thank you for that.
Thank you.
The results turned out to be somewhat different than our research. So your results, I think we can look to the bar on the right if you're looking at the same kind of screen I am, and it says about 41% think that you possibly have some applicability to you. I maybe didn't make that clear enough because our research, when we spend a little more time rather than just a question asking you to fill it out that fast, has much higher percentages in the last two. In other words, the sum of the last two, that probably applicable or it's definitely very applicable, is usually up and around the 75 or 80% range. And here it looks like it's 37%. So that's a little bit different result than what I might have expected, but let me just give you the punchline for it. And that is, if you have complex projects that have enough similarities that you can learn from one to the next, there's some proven techniques started by British Petroleum in the late 1990s that saved them about $80 million a year on 2 different initial applications. So let me give you an example of what one of those applications was, and maybe you'll change your mind as to whether or not you have large numbers of projects that have enough similarities. One of the requirements at British Petroleum is to go out and maintain these drilling platforms, and it's a period like every 3 or 4 or 5 years they need to go out and do total maintenance on the platform. Well, the platforms, there's thousands of them. They're doing this all the time. They have teams all over the world doing this all the time. And the platforms all differ by age and whether they're highly automated or not so automated, but every one of them has different things that can be learned. And they have found that when somebody goes out, and here I'm going to put my cursor over the keywords, to learn before, during, and after. In fact, this technique called the Lessons Learned Management Process is a refinement or an enrichment of something called an after-action review. Probably in one term or another, you've all heard the concept of an after-action review. You might have a slightly different name for it, but that basically says an after-action review, when done just as a tactical technique, like at the end of a project, it would be, what are we hoping to get done with this project? What actually happened? And if it wasn't exactly what we expected, that means there was a gap. So how did we handle that gap? And if we handled it well or not so well, what did we learn from it that we want to make sure to apply that learning next time? You know, it's changed the way we operate, which is another definition of learning. You know, you don't learn something just memorize and never use it again. Learning really means you've changed the way you operate. So learning before, during, and after is an enrichment of this basic after-action review. And British Petroleum saves huge amounts of money because they have these complex projects of maintaining an oil rig. It's about a 3-month process, 24-hour, round-the-clock staffing, because you have to turn off the oil and work on that platform until it's refurbished, and then you can turn the oil back on again. So it's critical to bring it up to speed as fast as possible and not make mistakes, not have a fire or something else like that. Well, as many people now are using this lessons learned, many organizations are now using this lesson learned management process. I use that as my first one because it's very much project management oriented. But it says to you, whether you're a project manager or somebody doing KM, here's one of many proven processes or techniques or whatever you want to call them that can substantially improve the performance of your organization. Let's take a look at another one. This one often gets confused, so I'm going to read it very carefully. This is the next poll. It says, do you in your organization have multiple essentially identical operations? Now, the prior one was you do essentially identical projects. This one is about operations, you know, an ongoing process, like assembly plants. The people who invented this, I'll get to in a second, was Ford Motor Company. They had 47 assembly plants around the world, and they all do essentially the same thing, make cars and light trucks. What if you have marketing offices in various cities in your country or various cities around the world? What if you had admin offices or retailing operations or product development operations? Do you have multiple essentially identical operations where the transfer of best practices from one location to another could be a benefit? So let me see what your answers might be for that. We got this hardcore of people that think it's possibly applicable. Now, I'm surprised at that because unless you're just a company that has one location someplace and you don't have multiple locations, if you have multiple locations, you by almost definition have this being probably applicable to you. But I'm getting a few people to swing over. I don't mean to bias the voting here, but I was surprised at the results. There's a hardcore of folks here that think many of these things are possible. But our research says that, in fact, about, again, 75 to 85% of the people, if they understand what multiple essentially identical operations represent, most of them come in with a 4 or a 5. So again, yours is about just under 50%. The biggest one, though, was only possibly applicable. So I don't know that we'll have a cumulative summary result at the end, but some of you that said possibly might on this one be saying probably or definitely. And some of you said not at all applicable, might on another one say probably or definitely. In other words, to be successful in transforming your organization, not every one of these techniques have to apply to you, but you need to know that there's about 15 of these, some of which really do. And the ones that really do can have a substantial improvement in your performance, and there's proven how to do them. So let's take a look at this one. I mentioned it was Ford Motor Company. They started to work on this in the early 1990s, and they saved about $150 million a year during their first 5-year development with regard to auto assembly plants. And they liked the project so much, they re-implemented it again in the next 5 years, and they had similar kinds of results. They were saving $750, almost $1 billion over a 5-year period, just implementing a process. And the process simply said, and I'll describe it to you so you get some sense for it, how common sense it is, and yet it's not trivial to implement it. You've got to have good project management skills to implement it and be successful. But think of an assembly plant. A typical assembly plant has about, let's say, 40 workstations. It doesn't matter whether it's 40 or 37 or 42, but think of a typical workstation. It might be where they mount wheels. Across every one of Ford's 48 assembly plants, somebody or some team is mounting wheels. When they went in and did the research, they found huge discrepancies between those who were really good at mounting wheels and those who weren't. And the discrepancy was a 5-fold difference. The people, and I'm just using one simple metric, which is how long it took them to do it. There's more involved, but I take only that one metric so we can understand it easily. In the best wheel mounting operations, it took about 1.5 minutes to mount a set of wheels on a car as it was going down the assembly line. In the worst wheel mounting operations, it was taking about 8 minutes or so. About a 5-fold difference between the best and the worst. And that's what this technique is all about. If you can find people in your organization, whether it's across 40 different assembly plants or maybe only 5 different sales offices or whatever it is, there are always better operations than in some places than in others. In fact, there's been much research on this project, and they have uncovered a 2-fold difference on average between the best and the worst. So in other words, in the average assembly plant, mounting wheels would be twice as good someplace as it is in the worst place. And when you can improve the performance across your entire organization from half as good as the best available to almost as good as the best available, that can make a substantial improvement. And it doesn't take sophisticated next generation technology or anything else like that. It just takes good project management skills to implement something such as this and show that benefit. All right, let's go to the next one. I'm going to try to pick up my pace here. Innovation. How many people think competitive pressures, disruptive technologies, and other things are impacting you? Let's just go right to the let's just go right to the survey. In other words, how important is innovation? We had some techniques in terms of innovation that can substantially improve your organizational performance. Do you think that would probably apply to you, that you jump on that? Okay, well, there's a little different score coming in this time. Maybe it's because I'm biasing you, and that's maybe why I should not. We should go through and do all these, and then we come back and analyze them. So maybe I've biased a few of you to think that, well, you know, maybe that is applicable to us, or it's definitely very applicable. But here's that group again, that the naysayers who are someplace in the middle. They're still dominating. They're pretty close to it. So the results here, they're climbing. It's up to 59. Well, maybe that's 60. Whatever. It's there's a balance, a little bit higher balance here between probably applicable and definitely applicable. I am amazed that almost all of you aren't saying that if we could become much more innovative, we'd be doing much better. Think about the implications of what this scoring is here. Someone says, no, that's 0 up there. 6% of you say unlikely that we could be innovative and improve our operations. It'd be interesting to do a second tier of analysis here and find out what kind of organizations are you working for that don't think you could ever improve your organizations or don't care to improve it. So that's an interesting side note. We don't have the time to dig down, but most organizations that we deal with, whether it's government or military or commercial organizations, are coming up with about 80 to 85, maybe even 90% on this one. That the ability to be more innovative is going to be critical to our future success. All right, let's go on and try another one. Now, well, let me give you what the solution there is. Something called wisdom of the crowd. I don't have time to teach that to you at the moment, but it's a way of automating the opinions of large numbers of people in your organization. And the good opinions surface, and the companies generally, when they get involved in something like this, say, if something emerges out of all this collaboration going on these automated systems, where people can suggest something, critique something, score something, and the best will surface, they will go ahead and implement those best things. And it's still early to see all the results from this, but the people who are doing it kind of anecdotally are saying this is the most powerful way to improve innovation. The old approach, and I take 15 minutes to describe this, but the old approach of an inbox, a suggestion box, has been outmoded. It's never proved to be as good as it possibly could have been. But this automated approach of the inbox, it has some fantastic potential for the future. All right, only number 4 here. I'm getting close here. I got I'm not going to get through all 11. This one says training. Well, this is your favorite subject. You thought this is the thing that was heavily impacting the world. So how effective? I expect them to get some high scores in this one. Training needed to upskill the workforce, especially in complex or rapidly changing environments, or if you're experiencing high turnover. Whoops. What's the scores on that? Well, I guess we know from my first polling question that you're all, maybe a bunch of you are in training, so you're biased. I'm not saying it's good, bad, or otherwise. Being biased is not necessarily bad, but you certainly have some emphasis on the concept of training. Well, there's all kinds of new things going on in training these days, so that's the dominant one this time. I don't have time to go through these and describe to you, but there's all types of new technology being applied, whether it's meetings like this that are remote or other concepts. Let's see, what would be one that I could speak to? Let me just give you, well, no, I'll just leave that one for that. You're probably well versed in training. All right, let's look at, I'm going to skip over, now onboarding. Okay, let's just take a moment on it. Could we improve the onboarding? In other words, when people join our firm, they come and during the first week, they sit down and HR gives them a whole bunch of stuff to read and whatever else. And that doesn't seem to ever be very efficient. So what do you think about the onboarding? All right, well, this is split across 4 categories, even unlikely applicable to you. Let me give you one little piece of information that might change your mind. During the first week of onboarding with a company, a very high percentage of people make their retention decision in that first week. In other words, if you do a lousy job with the people during that first week, you probably can only count on keeping them for some short period of time. Now, in every country, what a short period of time is varies, so I'm not going to say what the specific is. But if you thought the average retention for a person was 3 to 5 years, people who have a bad onboard experience are looking to turn over and leave you within a year or year and a half. That's how dramatic it is. And I'm sure you all appreciate the cost of recruiting a new replacement and bringing them up to speed, thinking about training again, bring them up to speed in terms of training to get them fully competent. Let me just give you an example of it. I like this example. One company that had a very sophisticated call center because they have some very complex products had an actual in-house university where people would go and get trained over a period of about 3 months before they'd come and sit at the call center and take over the call center seat. Unfortunately, this call center operation was a very tense, nervous, can't think of the right word to use there, but people would find that they just couldn't handle the stress. And about 50% of the people would resign within a few weeks. So somebody very bright in that company said, and it could have been anybody, any project manager with an analytical mind, who said, this seems silly. We're losing half the people within a couple of weeks. Why don't we try to figure out which ones are not going to survive the stress first? And so because they were biased towards training, such as you folks are, they came up and said, well, rather than sending the people to the university right now, why don't we figure out a slightly different form of training where they'll shadow a person at the call center. In other words, their first 2 weeks on the job is not to run off to the university for 3 months, it's to sit there behind somebody who's a present call center operator. And at the end of about 2 weeks, sure enough, about half the people couldn't take the stress and they left, which meant what? On first blush, it says, well, we're only going to train people that are going to stay with us. That's a good, only have half the people going to the university, but the ones that graduate from the university will probably be highly likely to stay with us. But they uncovered something, the word serendipity, something that was totally unexpected. What they uncovered was 2 weeks of sitting behind somebody, shadowing them, better prepared them for that job than 3 months at the university. Now, I don't know what was going right or wrong at that university, but it clearly wasn't teaching the kinds of skills other than the stress situation we've already addressed. But it wasn't teaching the kinds of skills that the people would really need to be effective call center operators. So I guess the point here worth mentioning is, in the knowledge age, we start dabbling with these things. Have a bright idea and think, well, we could do a little pilot, see what the impact is. And sometimes those pilots have serendipitous results that are overwhelming. Okay, expert locator. Do you ever have, we're going to another poll now, poll number 6. Do you ever have a need for quick access to a expertise or to experts? I mean, like experts to staff a project or expertise to get a question answered? Go ahead and answer that one. All right, well, I'm getting not applicable at all. Now that is a totally unusual response. Now some people backed off as soon as I picked on them. I'm not picking on you personally, but there was a whole percentage, very high percentage of not applicable at all. I cannot imagine an organization, now it's dying up. I mean, they're convincing you, maybe it's some default there. You end up being at the one category if you haven't yet entered your response. I cannot see any organization that doesn't occasionally have need for some expertise. So you're up there. Looks like the dominant one now is probably applicable. Our research results say it's up around 80 to 90, and even above 90% on this. Of people that say yes, in our organization there are times when we need to find somebody can help us answer a question, or find somebody who can fill a slot, maybe on a temporary basis, like a project. And out of that whole concept of finding expertise, there's another technique which maybe many of you heard called communities of practice, where people are combined, those people that have a common practice or a common skill, not just people who happen to be in the same company, but people who are in the same company have the same skill sets, so they can collaborate. It makes it easier for them to find. The background on this one is Yellow Pages. When they were started in the mid-1990s to replace hardcover phone books with digital, as soon as they had done that, somebody said, well, you know, we got everybody's name and phone number. It's easy to open up a few more fields and let the people put in a brief statement of their bio. Now we could search on it. If we needed somebody who's good at X, we could find 3 or 4 people that quickly. Got the concept there? So that's what expertise location is all about. The poll has just been erased, so I don't remember the exact results there, but there was quite a few of you thought that might be helpful. Okay, here's one that I'm going to be totally amazed if you aren't very high in the 4 and 5 on this one. Knowledge flight. There's a concept called the baby boomer generation, which were those children that were born after the Second World War, which in fact was a world war. And those people are getting up to and already into retirement. And when you take somebody that has 35, 40 years of expertise and they waltz into retirement and take that expertise with them, you have a real drain, a real knowledge flight. So how many of you have this issue going on where you're losing people due to retirement? Again, I've forced you to be biased a little bit higher on the spectrum. In the United States and where I teach in other parts of the world, it's usually much higher than this, 67%. In some classes, it's almost 100%. So the population we're tapping into here in this webinar is different than the population I'm usually addressing. That's not saying good or bad, it's just different. But just do know that if you have people who are getting close to retirement, you can, there's a technique that was developed by Lockheed Martin back in the mid-2000s that researchers have analyzed the results of this technique as it's been improved. And it will cover the following statistics. When a person retires, they have certain critical knowledge that's in their head and leaves. And what they're hoping to do is capture as much as possible of that critical knowledge and retain it in the organization. And this technique, the knowledge transfer and retention process, has been shown to capture 91% of the critical knowledge before it leaves. Now, many organizations have used mentoring. That's a solid technique, but it doesn't compare with this particular variation. It's about 61%. And every organization I've ever talked to does exit interviews. Well, they're next to worthless. But a lot of organizations put some faith in and hope in the exit interviews, but next to the very sophisticated approaches, they might as well not even do them. You're just wasting your time. If I had a little more time here, maybe somebody will ask me a question about it. I can come back and summarize one of the unique insights in that one. I want to just run through the last few here real quickly. We have a few more to go, and then I'll conclude, and we can open it up to questions and answers. How many have customer satisfaction as an important aspect of their organization? Your success depends on whether you really satisfy your customers or not. Oh, well, we must be talking in this category to entirely different organizations than we've talked to in the past categories. This looks like what I would normally expect. It's 86. Well, it's bouncing around a little bit, but it's up in the 80s, mid 80s. It's 83 right now. When it's stabilized, it looks like it'll be 80 something. Whoa, whoops, what? Some people are leaving. So maybe it's about 80. Okay, about 80%. If your customer satisfaction is important to you, there's some new scientific breakthroughs that started in the period around 2006 through 11. The science is there, and the process that followed the science has also been well developed. I don't have time to teach you that, but if customer satisfaction is an important thing in your organization, in the discipline of knowledge management, there is a proven solution to that which will substantially improve your customer satisfaction. And it takes project management people to be able to implement such a project, such a concept. All right, number 9. All right, here's a very important one. Is organizational performance important to you? Now, you're not answering? Oh, okay, now people are dropping off and definitely moving back up to where they used to be. Okay, don't too many of you move. It should be absolutely important to you. I'll let the numbers play out, but it looks like it's pretty high up there, getting up into the 90%. This is the first one that's up into the 90%, and I congratulate you on this one. This is one of the most important things you can do in an organization, and here's some results. To implement a performance evaluation process, that means metrics, okay? That means having a way to track what's going on and compare results against what your plans were and to correct if you're going astray. There's some very powerful research that was published just last year by McKinsey, and they took a long list of the kinds of techniques that we apply in project management, knowledge management, and elsewhere, and they ranked them based on how much impact on the organizational performance does each one of these things have. And most of them were in the range of 3 to 5 times more likely to be. See where my cursor is going down here? Most of the techniques that you should employ in your organization to improve its overall performance, like let's say change management, are in the 3 to 5 times more likely to be successful. But having a performance evaluation system was 7.3 times more likely to be successful. Now, who wouldn't implement performance evaluation systems if you knew it was the most important thing you could do? That's what knowledge managers focus on. The most important things that have the highest impact, and that is one of them right there, if not the one. And I'm glad you all agreed. You're up around 90% before the numbers split. Number 10 out of 11, employee engagement. We've already talked about that one. And I guess, well, I'll let you fill it out here very quickly. Do you want to increase and sustain your employee well-being, their motivation, their personal development? In other words, you want high-performing people or not? And we know the research says only about 25 to 30% of people in the world are high-performing. And look at the gap between 25 or 30 and something much higher. Okay, you're all coming around to this presentation. You're up around 90%, maybe even over 90 on this one. All right, well, this is exceptionally important, no question about it. You poll top executives around the world, and they say the most important thing to us, what keeps us awake at night, is our employees' performance. Well, you have to have a performance management system to measure it, but you also need to know what engagement is and how you're going to improve engagement. Okay, again, I don't have time to give you a full disclosure. Each one of these topics here is worthy of a mini course on it. But the technology was developed by Gallup organization in the early 2000s, and now it's being accepted around the world, and many organizations are beginning to focus on engagement. But what I have found is a lot of them talk a good story, but they don't follow through. So performance review systems would have them evaluate and follow through. But there's great potential here. Now, number 11, the last one, content, documents, records. Eliminate knowledge silos, promote knowledge sharing. In other words, I want to improve the findability and discoverability of content, documents, records. This is not talking about finding an expert. This is talking about something that has been documented and is in a repository. That's the, I'll use the word right here, but the repository of your word for that. Okay, it looks like a high percentage of you already have a repository. You think it's important. So this is another one where it'll be up around 90%. And here it's definitely very accurate. Well, let me give you something that may not be a surprise to you. A repository is probably the most implemented KM initiative of any initiative. It's been implemented since KM started back in the mid to late 1990s. And it has some great potential. But because of poor project management implementation of repositories, most of them are mediocre. Now, I didn't give you the statistics, but the research says when you ask people, how easy is it for you to find information? You know, very easy, difficult, impossible. 61% of people are dissatisfied with their repository. So apparently most of you think this is important. I know for a fact that most every organization has some form of repository. They're spending large sums of money on it, sometimes tens of millions of dollars, including IT staffs that number in the 10s and 20s and 30s of people. And yet the results are minimal, only because you're not doing it very well. This is the startup domain for KM. It's become the most popular KM initiative, and unfortunately, KMers have not paid enough attention to it to make it successful. And yet it's universal, it's ubiquitous, but not successful. All right, so you all think that it was important, and it's probably because most all of you have one. I'm about to close out here and say that KM came up over the horizon back around 1995. A number of us got in it in those days, but we didn't know what we were doing. I'll just freely admit that. There were a few top pilots of various things, like Ford Motor Company was piloting the best practices. British Petroleum was piloting the lessons learned, and others were piloting various other things. But very few were really panning out, and very few companies had the wherewithal to do more than just a couple of things. In fact, most were doing just repositories. So this is my conclusion, and I'm a few minutes over my schedule here, probably because I got hung up on not getting my video done right, so I apologize for that. But here's my conclusion. The most recent major episodic event has supplanted muscle and computer power with knowledge is power. Knowledge is the future of the world, especially human occupations. The acceleration of disruptive technologies, robots, drones, and AI has already had an impact and will continue to have even more impact in the future. There's a statistic in the United States that says, and probably up in a lot of other countries as well, that says in the next 15 years, 47% of job categories will disappear. Job categories that were usually used to be done by humans will totally disappear off the face of the earth. What's an example of one? Truck drivers. In the United States, there's 2 million truck drivers. By next year, 250,000 of them will be replaced by autonomous trucks that can drive on the highways and not need a driver. Just to give you a hint. So what are those drivers going to do? They're going to have to find some other occupation. So here's the conclusion. As a result, human occupations will drastically change. And knowledge management, it's going to become an imperative if it isn't already. I think it is already. Some of you may think it is. Hopefully after this presentation, more of you are giving some credibility to it. But it's the emerging discipline that's going to manage this transformation, this episodic change in human occupations that has only happened 4 other times in the last 10 to 12,000 years. And KM, the knowledge age, needs experienced business practitioners who know how to manage such complex endeavors. I'm talking to you guys. Now, not all of you are project managers, but I'm talking in particular to project managers. In fact, in one of my recent classes, almost half the students were project managers. Now, 20 years ago, 10 years ago in my classes, there wasn't that at all. So project managers are beginning to see the opportunities to apply their project management skills into this great opportunity called knowledge management. And to leverage your skills and lead, either become a PMO executive or a chief knowledge officer. That's the top rung of what knowledge management is. The top knowledge person in an organization is called a chief knowledge officer. I consider it higher than a chief information officer. I don't want to badmouth any chief information officers, but CIO is becoming an outsourced occupation. It's in the cloud. There'll be a lot of IT people who work for companies that support the cloud, but in most corporations in the next 10 to 20 years, there'll be fewer and fewer IT people and CIO dominance. But in the future, the knowledge officer is going to become the equivalent of what the IT officer, the CIO was, or has been over the last 20, 30, or 40 years. I think that's about the end of my presentation. It must be. Here's a picture of all your past ones. We're 2 minutes late, but I have time to answer any questions, and we still have a vast majority. I see a counter up here, and it started at 183, and it's still 159. So some of you may hang on. I've been hanging on until I was done. Then you're going to politely leave, and others might want to hang on a little longer. And again, you're not seeing my face, but oh, there you is my face up there in the speakers. Next time we'll get this video working, and you'll see my face. But hopefully you've gotten something from this presentation. Hopefully I opened your eyes to some areas that you have not looked at in the past. And it says now project managers have great skill sets, and it's needed in transforming organizations. And if all you've been doing in your organization, and I'm not demeaning it, all you've been doing in your organization has been managing projects, you might have an opportunity to go on and manage the transformation of your organization. But that's your call. All right, I'm open to any questions. Saadi, you going to run the question?
Yes. First of all, Douglas, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I really loved the 11 polls. I saw lots of knowledge out of these. So it reminded me when I learned the strategy implementation professional standard, the 7 domains. Now you have 11 domains in knowledge management. And I believe they are very, very interesting. I personally, as I said, had an experience with a certified knowledge manager. And this is when you spoke about lessons learned. But he took together, when we were developing a PMO, we took the lessons learned into something furthermore, into enhancing and developing the process so that a positive lesson is sustained there. It's implemented every time. It becomes part of it's an asset for the organization and becomes part of the process to be replicable. Whereas a mistake that requires to enhance the process to prevent it also becomes there as a filter or as a checklist to prevent us from paying for the same mistake twice. This is a partial experience in the power of knowledge management.
I agree. And the key there is when you learn something from a project, it has to be documented so that it can be reused. It can't just stay in the heads of the 2 or 3 people that learned it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I clicked the little switch here and it says video on, and I'm seeing myself, but I don't know if any of you are seeing it.
1 minute. Can you turn the video on?
Well, is this a Zoom meeting we're in?
No, it's not Zoom. It's Webinar Jam.
This is my last Zoom meeting that I turned on.
If you had the Zoom on, it will steal the camera from Webinar Jam. Yes. So one thing. It's better to turn off all the social media applications before turning on this one.
Right.
Anyway. Okay, if you can turn on the camera, it's good. Meanwhile, let me start with the questions because we have lots of questions. Okay. Okay. So I'm gonna start. Muhammad Salahuddin, he's saying K-Age is not only about AI; it's mainly about human, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
The AI is going to complement humans, and in many cases going to replace humans, but ultimately, because everybody's going to have AI, it's going to be a commodity. But what are you going to do with the human power, that knowledge power Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Good student. He would have gotten 100% on the quiz.
So now we have from our friend Fathi Jahdami from Oman. Isn't the right time for developed countries to invest in educating third world citizens in AI as a step forward to source new brains and help these countries to bridge the gap in AI and developed world?
Wow, that's a little off tangent from what I've been talking about. I'm really a favorite. You know, that's one of my favorite areas, AI. But it's so diverse. I mean, what do you train somebody in? You have to give them the basic skills so they can get into whatever AI is appropriate for their own country. But AI is the future, no question about it. So if you want job opportunities, there's two that are becoming dominant. One is some involvement with AI, which is more computer and programming type skills, and the other one involvement with data analytics. Last year, before the virus hit, the United States had 150,000 job vacancies in data analytics because it's emerged so quickly out of nowhere, and very few are competent to become good data analytics. So those are two very powerful jobs for people who want to have a specialty. I'm talking to some of you who might be already doing some of those things. Project management is more ubiquitous. I mean, it's a skill that overrides all kinds of things. If you're going to be in data analytics, somebody has to be managing the projects that use data analytics. If you're in AI, somebody's going to be managing the projects that designs the AI or implements the AI technology and whatever it's being implemented. Both, yeah, 100% AI and data analytics are jobs of the future, but I also maintain comparable to them are the jobs that are going to optimize human performance.
Okay. Now, a question from Muaz Gharbi. What kind of attitude an employee needs to acquire in order to be engaged, and what are the steps required to do so, and how organizations can help enhance that engagement?
Wow, that's not a trivial question to answer. But if you I hate to put the burden on you, if you go to Gallup organization, you will see what they've done. They have been so elegant in their solution, their research on engagement, that they're able to narrow the whole concept of engagement down to 12 questions. And if you poll the people in your organization on those 12 questions, you will see where the gaps are. For people to be engaged, they really have to be responding positively to most all of those 12 questions. And if they're not responding positively, then they'll never be engaged or they're far from it. So let me just tell you the first two. The first one is, I know what's expected of me. So if you have a person on your staff who comes to work not knowing what they're supposed to be doing today, when somebody explains something to them, they don't clearly understand it, you got the point, right? That person is always under stress. They don't know what's expected of them. They will never be engaged. They're just looking for 5 o'clock or whatever your end of day time is to get out of there and go home and hope they don't get fired. No, that's pretty well too extreme. But the first one is they don't know what's expected of them. The second one in this hierarchy that goes through the 12, and they actually do climb as they go through the 12. The second one is they have the tools and equipment or whatever you want to call it that enables them to do their work correctly. Got that point? You say, go build a house, but you don't give somebody a hammer and nails. I mean, what are they going to be able to do? So the first two is they know what they're supposed to do and they got the tools to do it. After that, it gets a little more esoteric. I'll give you one that stands out in my mind. Well, two of them. One is they have a good friend at work. Now that's a simple question. It gets right at the heart. If you don't have a good friend at work, then you probably aren't friends with too many people at work. And in fact, it's implying, the research has uncovered, that's implying that work environment is not a very friendly work environment. But if you have good friends at work, it's a totally different environment. So the simple question, 1 out of 12, is, do you have a best friend at work? And the last one, the highest up on the hierarchy, because they don't teach it this way, but this is what you get out if you really get into it. The last one of the 12 questions says, do you have opportunities to learn and grow? Now, if you don't even know what's expected of you, and you don't even have the tools to do your work right, you're not even thinking about opportunities to learn and grow. So it is a progression. I'm waving my hands here, you're not seeing me. It is a progression from the most fundamental of things up to the much more advanced. Kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Remember that you studied in college, the pyramid? The lowest levels is security, food, and the security, and the highest one is the personal aspirations and personal attainment. I forget what the exact word they use. But that's what this engagement is all about. It's not hokey. It wasn't invented by somebody one night and wrote a good book on it. No, this is research that Gallup did in the early 2000s, and the base was 20 million interviews. So we're talking about research that you never get in business. Only in the health environments can you even possibly think about getting this kind of sample sizes. But Gallup is a huge organization. They do research for corporations, and they consolidate all that, and they come up with these kinds of things. There's one other that's worth mentioning, and I hope all of you go back and look into this personally. Gallup uncovered, while they were doing all this extensive research, that us as humans have 34 different potential traits. In other words, when you're born as a human, you can be right-handed and left-handed. You got two traits in terms of handedness, right? But in terms of all these other things, there are 34 defined traits that humans will have some of them, but not all of them. And by the time you become mature, about somewhere between 5 and 10 of those traits have become your dominant traits. And if you want to really love your work, you want to be very good at it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then you should be working in jobs that are capitalizing on your dominant traits, not the ones that you do not have as dominant. So let me give you one that everybody can relate to. If I ask the question, is anybody in here metric phobic, in other words, fear of metrics? You don't like to deal with the numbers, you like the other side of it? Usually in classes, about half the people are metric phobic and the other half love metrics, okay? Well, if you love metrics, you want a job that allows you to be very analytical. If you're not analytical at all, that's not one of your traits at all, an analytical job is a very tough one. You're under stress. Now, maybe you get it done. Maybe you're very bright and you stick to it. You stay with it until you get it done. You might still be doing a good job, but you're not going to love what you're doing. Okay, so when you understand what your traits are, and you make sure the kinds of work you do is aligned with those traits, you will love what you're doing and you'll be high performing. So I find that as powerful as a prescription to somebody as the 12 questions that are more corporate-wide, see how your corporation is doing, and this is much more personal. If anybody wants some insight on those 12 traits, I peppered my slide or two with my email. Send me your email, and I will send you back what I give in class. It's a little self-assessment. You go online with Gallup and pay them $50 or so, and you can do an automated one. But if you want it for free, it's a manual one, and you have to look at my instructions.
I'm sure Mustafa will send it to all once we have it. Now, I have some questions. By the way, one thing about the first two questions you spoke about Gallup, it just struck to my mind that these are things that the organization is responsible for. So if people don't know what they should do, and they don't know or they don't possess the necessary tools or the right environment, these things are the organization's fault, let me say, which means getting engaged in part is the responsibility of the organization. This is just a thought that came to my mind.
Well, it's a good thought, and I congratulate you for it, because that's exactly correct. So there's two things that can go on in an organization. One is the 12 questions, which enables an organization to take the pulse of how engaged people are and correct where they're not. Okay, so that's the organization doing it. And I also told you the flip side of it is what you can do for yourself to make you have the kinds of work that you really love to do. So if people in an organization are taught both sides of that coin, you will have a very productive organization.
Okay. Now I have a question that came in multiple tastes from our Sam Fakhouri, one of our ambassadors. What are the key skills of the Chief Knowledge Officer? Also, one of our stars, Victorine Ghubaira, what are the critical success factors for the Chief Knowledge Officer? And also, our friend Ferdinand Furia, are there specific prerequisites for a person to be a knowledge management officer? So everybody's asking about this guy. Who or she are they?
Well, there's a bunch of them around the world, and they don't all fit the exact same mold. So there isn't one stereotype of what a chief knowledge officer is. But from my own personal experience, having taught 10,000 students who all got the Certified Knowledge Manager, and many of whom went on to lead KM teams, and some went on to become chief knowledge officers, I would say the most important skills you need are the ability to successfully transform your organization. And to transform your organization, there are a set of strategies that you absolutely positively need to implement. And if you do it successfully, your organization will begin to transform, and you can ride that. In terms of your own personal skills, well, everybody has, we just talked about traits. I mean, no two people are identical in terms of those traits. So if you don't have, well, let me just be very specific. If you are not analytical at all, that trait about metrics or performance evaluation is not going to be one you're going to be very hot on doing. But you need to be smart enough and put your ego aside enough to say, yes, I'm not good at analytics. I wouldn't know how to run a performance evaluation system, but let me get somebody on my team who can run that piece of it because it is so essential to our success. So a chief knowledge officer doesn't have to be an expert in any one thing. They have to have the broader picture of things. And they have to have these broader skills, like project management skills, to be able to handle a project from start all the way through to finish. And multiple projects, because there's going to be multiple things you're going to do, every one of which is an independent, autonomous project in and of itself. So if you want more research on that, and you want to do it very quickly, you can go look and see what kinds of things we teach the CKM program, the Certified Knowledge Manager. And I'll add one more sentence. I mean, it sounds like a sales pitch, but we have geared that program. I've been teaching it now for 19 or 20 years, and I had 10,000 students, and it has evolved over time. And here's where it is today. The Certified Knowledge Manager teaches you all of the things you need to know to have the potential to become a Chief Knowledge Officer someday. But it just isn't enough time to do all that. So this year we're implementing a Master CKM, which is specifically geared towards the executive level to go beyond the CKM. If you've been a CKM, a Certified Knowledge Manager, a KM team leader, and you've been doing more tactical things, and you're thinking about wanting to go strategic, because that's one of the requirements of having a CKO. The CKO is a senior executive, and it means doing strategic things, not tactical things. So if you want to transition from the tactical to the strategic, which is transformation, then where the Master CKM is going to dig much deeper into those kinds of requirements. If you want any more information than that, you can ping me on an email, but our website will describe some of that. It doesn't describe much about the Master CKM, because we're going to implement that by now, but going virtual, all of a sudden, I'll put that one on the back burner for another couple of months.
Douglas, we're gonna discuss later on about how you will be offering a course to our group, to advisors webinars, which will be a very much discounted course. Now I'm saying this to you for the first time, but we're gonna talk about this later on. Now, Karen Bronman, she has a question about also one of our ambassadors. The CKO needs change management skills too.
Yeah, is that a question? Is that an assertion? Your question?
Yes, it's a question.
Yeah, well, it could have been an assertion. Absolutely, positively, no questions asked. A CKO needs to be quite expert or have on their team a group of people who have the expertise in change management. But let me be very careful here. There are two types of change management. The type that you're used to is what I call traditional change management. I'm not demeaning it or oversimplifying it, but basically it says if I'm going to install a system, before I install it, I need to tell people. That's the communications plan. And about the time I'm going to install it, I need to train them. That's the learning plan. So traditional change management has these two parts, a communications plan and a learning plan. But transforming an organization is a much more comprehensive task. It's not telling the people that we're going to install a system. It's informing them and getting them highly motivated to transform the entire organization. The concept of engagement, absolutely, that's wrapped into it. So you want to be pushing people towards a much higher level of engagement, but all part of transforming the entire organization. And so if you're thinking about change management, don't think about the typical change management you see in the books, which I call traditional. You have to start looking at transformational change management. And there's all new stuff coming out in the last couple of years. Well, let me give you one statistic. Some of you are into change management. A few people that asked the question about it probably know John Kotter. Okay, he's been the #1 guru in change management from 1995 to about 2010 or so. Wrote many books. You know, nobody can challenge him as having been the #1 guru in change management, and actually was talking about transformational change, even in those early days. He acknowledged in his books, and most of the people who were consultants in the time of 2000 to 2010, that if you're going to make major changes in an organization, your likelihood of success is about 30%. Now, who wants to get involved in something that's only got a 30% likelihood? Well, you better really pay attention to take a piece of that 30% because a lot of failures occur. Now, some of you may have been involved in some of those failures, but that was the statistic that most people relied on and quoted. And so there was a lot of anecdotal evidence that said doing major transformational change was not very successful. Just as I told you, repositories have had a 61% failure rate. But the most recent research that McKinsey and others have been working on since 2010 or so now claim if you do it well, your success likelihood is 79%, not 30. Now, 79, I get on that. I can say, well, you know, I can screw up a little bit, but boy, if I really stick to it, this thing ought to be a success at a 79% success likelihood. When it's 30%, boy, you're shooting craps. I don't know what an appropriate expression would be, but you're really taking your long shot chances when it's only 30%. So in the early days of KM, if we tried to transform likelihood, we would be unsuccessful. Today, we know how to do it. Good question.
Okay. Okay. Now, we already exceeded our time, but we still have 134 people, so I'm going to go on a little bit more. There are some interesting questions. One of them, is it important to have some kind of knowledge management manual or procedure in each organization?
It depends on what you mean by knowledge management manual. There needs to be a manual, or what I call the book of knowledge. You guys recognize that term, you know, not the PMBOK, but the KIMBOK. And so the KM book, I'm sorry, we call it the body of knowledge, and that's what PMBOK calls it now, but originally it was called the Project Management Book of Knowledge. So rather than a book, I would like to talk about a body of knowledge. The people who are doing KM need to have at their fingertips a body of knowledge. And that's why we've developed the KIMBOK, the KM body of knowledge. And you cannot do KM without having this rich body of knowledge. You cannot possibly keep in our heads all the stuff that's been known and we're learning. You have to have this kind of resource. So now, if you mean people in an organization, whether you've implemented a repository and you have some book that tells people how to use the repository, that's totally different than the KIMBOK. Okay, the KIMBOK is how you implement KM successfully. How you operate a particular tool or technology is totally different. Yes, the second one is definitely necessary. Whatever that implementation is, there needs to be some guidebook or handbook or something that goes along with it. But if you're asking what does a KMer need, yeah, the KIMBOK is what the KMer needs.
Okay. Now, from our friend from Canada, Muri Marhaba, he's going to be a future speaker in Batch 3 with us. He's saying it is important to recognize tacit knowledge because expertise rests on it, and it's a source of competitive advantage as well as being critical to daily management. About 90% of the knowledge in any organization is embedded and synthesized in tacit form. So if you agree to this statement, how do you collect the tacit knowledge?
Okay, I essentially agree with the statement. I agree with the part that says it's the most important. Others would challenge and say it's only 80% versus 90%. There's no way to know for sure, but it's certainly a very large number. So let's call it 85. How do you capture tacit knowledge and convert it into something that's useful? We talked about one or two of those. One is you have an expert locator, so you can find somebody that you could chat with and they might help you. The other is if somebody's retiring and you want to capture 91% of that critical knowledge, there are techniques that are able to do that. And again, we don't have the time for me to go through that. Unless somebody wants me to take 5 or 10 minutes to describe that one technique. But if you send me an email, I'll be happy to send you how you do that knowledge capture. That's the important thing. The most knowledge that's of value in an organization is not in the repository. If 80 or 85% is in, or 90% is in our heads, then a very small amount is in some document management system in the repository. Most of it's in people's heads. You have to have the kind of environment in your organization where people are willing and able to share with each other, or we have processes that are able to get that knowledge out of their head. I don't mean you reach in there and grab it and pull it out. Those people that are retiring have to be motivated to want to do that. But if they are motivated to want to do that, there are some scientifically proven techniques that can be successful at it. Good question, absolutely correct. And then many people in KM today come from IT, and they think IT is what KM is all about, and therefore only the repository is important, because IT focuses on explicit knowledge as opposed to tacit, on the tangible knowledge that might be in a repository, not the tacit, intangible knowledge that's in somebody's head.
Now, a question from our analytics expert, Dr. Kibbe. He gave a nice presentation the other day, and he's saying, how is knowledge management changed by data analytics?
How does it change what?
How is knowledge management changed by data analytics?
Because data analytics is going to create a lot of new knowledge that we had no way of getting in the past. I mean, it opens up a wealth of new knowledge that used to be just by experience. We're going to have way more available to us than just by experience. Remember my little definition? Knowledge is understanding gained from experience. I'm sorry for that. Which has historically been the truth. I'm sitting here at my wife's desk and I don't know how to turn off her phone. I can turn the speaker off. Okay. Before I lose my train of thought here. So most all knowledge was based on experience. The next major source of knowledge is what I call analytics, which is data analytics. I mean, the availability of all this research, whether it's Internet of Everything, or we call it Internet of Things, is going to provide immense amounts of knowledge. I mean, it's going to dwarf what we've had in the past, and it's going to give us very precise knowledge. So it's going to be analytics is going to be a major source of knowledge in the future. And KMers are focused on increasing knowledge, for sure. And then managing it well enough so that everybody has access to it. And we're increasing even more. You know, all that goes hand in glove with each other. So analytics people need to be on the KM team. Or run the KM team.
Okay. Interesting. Now, I'm going to take only the last two questions. From Samar Naufal, if we talk about the impact of smart technology, human knowledge, and more on knowledge management, how can specialized experts change the structure of the organization themselves to be the starting point, and where do we see that in the future?
Well, that's a tough question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for that one. Well, okay, so we're saying in the future there's going to be great innovative new technology enhancements. And how do we put them to work? And what will people do? No, I'm getting off the question. Well, first of all of these new technological innovations have to come from humans. Robots don't invent new technology. Robots just implement what humans are programmed to do and enable them to do. So it's going to be smarter and smarter humans that are going to create better and better technologies in the future. How do we implement them? Well, it's going to be people who say, I need to get a competitive advantage over whoever I'm competing with, and I can use this technology. I can come up with new ways to use this technology. That's just such a tough question. I mean, I really want to map that one out on a mind map. Okay. I don't have a good answer. I'm backing off. Apologize.
Okay, no problem.
I'm not going to be apologizing. Just give you a bunch of bull.
You know, the more experienced people, they use the term "I do not know" more than the ones who are less experienced.
Well, there you go. You just called me. I had to do it.
So the last question from Ahmed Al-Shuhri: what is the ROI on this? So if you go and implement knowledge management, and if you train your people knowledge management, and if you develop a process or a book or a guideline or a playbook for knowledge management and start to change or alter the culture in an organization, what is the ROI?
Okay, well, there's no easy answer to the question, what is the ROI, but it's quite substantial. Typically, and project managers always have to think about the ROI to get the project justified and financed. Typically, we're talking about the expenses being hard expenditures, like capital equipment, computers, etc. But in many KM initiatives, and ROI has to go initiative by initiative. There's no way of saying your ROI, if you start KM 20 years from now or 10 years from now, will be something, because it all depends on what kinds of initiatives you have. So each initiative has to stand on its own 2 feet, has to be justified. Let me give you some examples of the potential ROI, which you almost don't even need to calculate. So for instance, British Petroleum, once they had invented their technique called lessons learned, I'm going back to that one because it's very appropriate to project managers. Once they had developed their technique and learned before, during, and after, there was hardly any expense to implement that. It was just changing the people's attitudes about, we got to get together just before we start this project and make sure we gather the knowledge that already exists someplace in our organization about to handle the very specific problems that might arise with this specific drilling rig. Because our team has not been on that kind of drilling rig in the past, but there have been other people. So let's learn before we even go out, learn before. Then when you're out there on the drilling rig, at every shift change, you get together and say, okay, what's going on today? What did we run across that was new to us? How did we handle it? You guys coming on now with this shift need to be aware of this, that, and the other thing. That's learn during. And learn after is to capture all the things that were very important to your own particular project and pass them on to the next one. The incremental costs on top of your normal project expenses to do that are marginal. But British Petroleum was saving $80 million a year doing that. So $80 million is the return, and the investment is nominal compared to $80 million. Ford Motor Company, now they had to go out and analyze all 40 of their assembly plants and drill down to where they're measuring how long it took and what the costs were for somebody to mount wheels. But once they started saying, okay, these people are much better than those people, now all we have to do is set in place something that can transfer the knowledge from the people who do better to the ones who don't. And people in class sometimes say, well, yeah, it's a different country, they have a different language, I said, well, then just take a video of it. Some of these things are manual efforts. If you could show a person how you twisted it this way versus twisting it that way, you don't have to explain it in their language. Just show them how to do it. So again, the Ford Motor Company, after the initial research that uncovered this eye-opening, this epiphany, that there was great disparities across their 40 assembly, actually 38 assembly plants, sorry. Of course, there are 38 assembly plants and 40 some odd activities in every assembly plant. Then they started mandating that we've got to transfer that knowledge, and $150 million a year, year after year after year. And the last time they reported out was the second 5-year period. So it was 10 years of doing this and recovering about $150 million a year, year after year. And it didn't take much to operate that process once it was initiated. It was probably $1 million investment to uncover this thing in the beginning. But now you don't need to spend $1 million. You need to spend a couple of $1,000s to learn how to do it, and you can go out and implement it yourself. It almost makes common sense, but I'd always recommend somebody learn the best practices first, just rather than going out and trial and error. So you might spend a couple of $1,000s on a small staff of people, and you could go out and make that thing very successful on tens of thousands of dollars at the most. But the return, depending on the size of your organization and the disparities amongst the different operations, could be millions and millions and millions of dollars. So return on investment when you're leveraging intellectual knowledge is almost unessential after you pull off the first couple of ones. Now, if you want to buy a $10 million computer to house all your documents, yeah, then you're going to have to do some serious analytics, return on investment type analytics. But a lot of these other ones are just changing attitudes and ways to operate.
Okay, Douglas, now our question, I finished questions, but there are some questions I was not able, to ask them. But one question just attracted my eye. how to apply knowledge management to improve the efficiency of governmental organizations. Now, I believe, or administrations, I believe this question, you need to give us another webinar, perhaps in batch 3, to speak about it, because you have a wealth of knowledge. You worked in all over the world, in the States, in Dubai, in Oman, and so many different locations, and you specifically did that for government organizations. And I believe there is something we need to learn from you on this aspect. So now I'm not gonna ask you to answer this question, but I will ask you to prepare the answer in another webinar in early 2021. How about that?
That sounds like a good deal. And let me give you a statistic. If you count military as part of government, and some do or don't, they're civilian versus military, our students, government students, military and civilian, are well over 50% of all of our students. So it's not like just a few government people attend every once in a while. Government in many countries is serious about making substantial improvements, and they see knowledge management as one of the ways to do that.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Douglas, I sincerely thank you. I honestly say, although we did not see your face with us during the presentation, this is one of the most rewarding ones to me especially. Okay, I learned a lot and I enjoyed it, and I would like to thank you for all the knowledge and the patience you had with us tonight.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much for hosting me to do this, and I'll look forward to doing it again.
Thank you very much. Okay, see you soon, Douglas, and thank you our audience from. Usually we have people from around 80 countries, as shown in our ambassador draft. Until next week, where we are going to listen to Dr. Radia and about transformation and change. See you then, and stay safe. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye-bye.